Thinking Out Loud with Dave Palmer. Here on Morning Joy, where truth matters.
Welcome back to Morning Joy, where truth matters. I'm Keith Downey, your host, and we're going to be talking about the creation through the lens of St. Thomas Aquinas and why there are so many different creatures and so much inequality among them. Good morning, Dave.
Good morning, Keith. Good to be with you this morning. How are you?
I'm doing well. I can't complain. Just listening to Debbie and Adam trying to get rid of all of my attachments. That's my homework, especially with those USB cables. But yeah.
You can send a few of those this way if you'd like.
You got it.
Yeah. I'm always trying to find the connections between what was talked previously in the show and me. And, you think about it, if there were no poor people, there would be no opportunity for generosity of the rich people and, vice versa. So even the diversity of income, and I'm not saying that, we have to have poor people, but even Jesus said that, they're always going to be with us, that it allows for generosity, for there to be a diversity among even income levels. So I think there may be a tie in there. But, if people have been kind of following these segments we've had every Tuesday for a while, we've been kind of going sequentially through the Summa, and we started talking about the proof for the existence of God and then his attributes. We talked about the Blessed Trinity. And then last week, we talked about creation and how this intense love among the persons of the Blessed Trinity kind of bursts forth creation, like a man and a wife would burst forth with a created child, when they get married. It's an analogy I think most people can relate to. And so today I want to talk about the diversity and the inequality of things and why are there so many things and why so much diversity. And I want to time this out because I want to close with something very practical that I learned last weekend because I went to the Fullness of Truth conference in San Antonio, and many of the GRN folks were there. In fact, Sean Rice was the MC of the event. And something very practical that has to do with this whole topic that I learned from a couple of the speakers. So stop me before we end because I want to make sure I get that in if I time this all right, okay?
You got it.
So last week we talked about how even among the creatures, you might, in your room or wherever you are, you might see a cricket and then you see your dog and you see yourself and you think, wow, there is so much inequality even among the creatures of the world. Nobody would really think that a human being and a cricket are on the same level of dignity. And so, why is that? Why? And so why so many? If you Google the number of species of visible creatures in the world, I think it would come up to, I think like 7.8 million creatures, wow. 3,000 different species of snakes, which I personally don't think are enough, but it's amazing to think of the creativity of God. So there was a Muslim philosopher named Avicenna, and he said that God created what he called the first intelligence, like maybe the angels. And then he kind of stepped back, and then the angels created the next thing, and then they created the next thing. And so there was kind of these levels. And Thomas totally rejected that because he said the variety and the distinction of things. And I'll just read this because I think it's one of the most beautiful passages in the Summa. He says, we must say that the distinction multitude of things comes from the intention of the first agent, who is God, for he brought things into being in order that his goodness might be communicated to creatures and be represented by them. And because his goodness could not be adequately represented by one creature alone, he produced many and diverse creatures, that what was wanting to one in the representation of the divine goodness might be supplied by another. Okay, so I think we may have talked about this before, but I'm saying this to set things up so that when you see the diversity of creatures in the world, just say, praise God. God's telling me something about himself through all these creatures. And then he goes on and says, okay, well, why is there so much inequality? Why do we need, earthworms and slugs but then on one end, and then angels and human beings and dogs and cats and caterpillars, right? And there was an early church father named Origen who had a very interesting theory about this. He taught that God created rational creatures like human beings, and then they had free will, and when some of them used their free will well, they got elevated to being angels. And some of them who didn't do it so well got demoted into being irrational creatures like earthworms and dogs and cats and things like that. It was a very interesting theory, but Thomas, as you might expect, totally rejected that as being the reason for the inequality of things. And St. Augustine had a funny quote about this. In response to Origen, he said, "What can be more foolish than to say that the divine architect provided this one son for the world, not to be an ornament to its beauty, nor for the benefit of corporeal things, but that it happened through the sin of one soul, so that if 100 souls had sinned, there would be 100 sons in the world." I love that. So you
That's
imagine
great.
how it would change the way we look at the world, because then when we see irrational creatures, rather than looking at the beauty of them, we'd say, "Oh, wow, I wonder who sinned and became that, grasshopper," or "I wonder who sinned and, ended up being, that butterfly." You see the
Mosquitoes.
difference. Immediately it would bring a pessimism into the world, because everything would be a reminder of somebody messed up rather
Mm,
than, wow, look at that beautiful sunrise. Now that's what
yeah.
Augustine is getting at. So isn't that interesting?
So interesting. Yeah. Yeah, well, it's a little bit difficult when you think of some of the like the bugs. You're like, wow, there's so many of these bugs. Like, what good is this bug? You know?
Yeah. So Aquinas, as you might expect, has a response to Origen, and he
Mm-hmm.
says that he says natural things seem to be arranged in degrees, as the divine wisdom is the cause of the distinction of things for the sake of the perfection of the universe, so is it the cause of inequality. So what I like to say is, you see this hierarchy of things. Some clearly are really low, and then you rise
Mm-hmm.
up, and even among the irrational animals, they say some are really smart, like the
Right.
dolphins and the dogs and crows, they say, are smart. And so you see this gradation, right? But it brings your mind up, like, because it's leading to the top, right? And then all of a sudden
Yeah.
you see the human person, and wow, they're even more exalted and more amazing than all these irrational creatures. So you keep going up and up. And then, of course, we know through scripture that there are angels. And so you go even higher, and it brings your mind thinking, well, there must be some being way up high. Okay. So
Right.
as you see the inequality of things, you can see that really it's leading us up to God, because we're seeing how if everything was the same, I like to say, if every woman in the world looked like your wife, Keith, you wouldn't think your wife was special. But the fact that there is inequality makes
Mm,
her unique, right?
yeah. So true.
So, all right. So, which leads to the final thing, and then Thomas says, "Well, why is there evil then?" Okay, well, because there is evil and there's good, and if you remember, one of the attributes of God is that He is not only good, He is goodness itself, right? So why? And
Mm-hmm.
this is the question that puzzles so many people and causes so much atheism in the world: is that how could a good God allow so much evil in the world? And Aquinas says that evil is just the absence of good. And he
Mm,
says that God allows the evil in order that the good will be more manifest. And again, the reason we when something horrible happens, we see goodness pour out from it. The best example being the cross. And he gives an
mm,
example in the Summa. He says, if you see a fire burning a poor man's house, you might see that is evil because that poor man lost his house. But he says, no, you got to look at the universal, the big picture. Okay, what came out of that? What was the good? And so again, it's
mm,
it's classic optimism from Aquinas, where you see
mm,
even good coming out of the evil. And all right, and now
mm,
I'll tell you how this all plays into something that I learned at the conference last weekend. And by the way, he does say ultimately God is the cause of evil only in that he allows it to happen, right?
right.
Uh, he gives an example when a lion eats an antelope.
Mm-hmm.
That was evil for the antelope, good for the lion, but God allowed it to happen. So in that regard, he at least allows it. So I'm at the conference and I'm listening on Sunday morning, right before Mass, to a presentation by Dan and Stephanie Burke. I don't know if you've heard them
Mm,
from the Avila
yes.
Institute, and they said something that makes a lot of sense, that I think is a game changer. It has to do with everything that I've been talking about, is that they said that you have to remember that everything that happens in our life is either caused by God or allowed by God. All right. So it's either caused by God or allowed by God. Everything without exception. Okay. You can imagine, I mean, no exceptions.
Yeah.
And they said that totally changes the way you view life, because every misfortune, if your car breaks down on the way to work this morning, you get a flat tire, um, God forbid you lose your job. Well, you had to say, well, God allowed that, and then all of a sudden you start seeing this big picture. Yeah, that's an evil, that's a bad thing, but God allowed it. And so now you have to say, well, why? Well, okay, God, why did you allow this? There's got to be a big picture. You can see how putting this into perspective can fundamentally change the way you live your life, and also bring a lot more calm to you. So anyways, that's the practical application to all this, Keith.
No, that's very helpful because, like, for instance, the car trouble situation, I think everybody's experienced that. Like, it happens at the worst time all the time. And it's like, why is this happening? But when you bring to mind, like, well, God allowed this to happen, then you're like, okay, there's a reason why. Like, what am I missing here? Maybe there was a reason I needed to stop for a second. And maybe there was somebody that needed my help that I wouldn't have normally, been available to. But now that my car is, out of service, I can now have my attention focused on that. So that is really cool, and I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, I'm just thinking as you're saying that, your car breaks down and there might be somebody a mile behind you who's contemplating taking their life, and all of a sudden they see you, they stop to help and render aid, and you may never even know the story, but that one act of service that God allowed them to do may have given them a new lease on life. And why? Because your car broke down, which kind of ruined your day and made you late for the meeting. But I guess if you let yourself go there and see that there's probably something else going on in the big picture of things, like the fire, burning the poor man's house, changes your entire perspective.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dave Palmer, for joining us and giving that bit of joy this morning.